I admire Winter Crawford. I admired his tenacity. I admired his determination to write and speak the truth. And I admired his sense of urgency.
Inscriptions on tombstones, when interpreted, provide background information for fascinating analyses of societies, not just in aspects of how we celebrate the dead or the rituals we use for death, but in a broader and more comprehensive way. They provide collective perspectives on world views at given points in time, and they reflect the cultural aspects of the people who created these monuments or mementos. Of course, there is the obvious point that people immediately understand, such as genealogies, but far beyond this, they provide us with an intellectual discourse of the way previous societies have seen the world in which they lived, how they related to that broader view, and how this was played out. Tales from the Tombs.
Hello and welcome to this, the final program in the first series of Tales from the Tombs. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Last week we concluded a two-part segment from the Church of St. James where we looked at the memorial ledgers, the plaques and the vaults. This week we have traveled to the southern end of the island and we are about to reveal tales to be found here in the yard of Christ Church, Parish Church. Now, as has been the custom with all of our programs, we begin by placing things in the correct perspective. Our architectural historian, Senator Professor Henry Fraser, will provide some background information on the early history of this church.
This is the fourth Christ Church Parish Church, but the third on this site, because the first was actually at Dover on the edge of the sea, where it was destroyed by a hurricane with floods, and the church and the tombs were swept away, and bodies were on the beach, and it was described as a scene from Dante's Inferno. Well, the church was rebuilt here on the hill, and it was built in Gothic style, but very, very robustly. Ironically, it was damaged in 1831 in the Great Hurricane, and it was rebuilt and consecrated on the 1st of October 1837. 100 years later, when they were planning celebrations of the centenary of that church, there was a fire in March of 1935. And the church was rebuilt, retaining some of the walls and the western tower, and it was reconsecrated again on that important day of October the 1st, 1937. So it's a Gothic church, but unlike most of the Gothic churches in Barbados, it does not have all of the features of Gothic. Gothic architecture is described by many people as pointy architecture because the windows and the doors all have sharp points. The narrow windows are called lancet windows because they're so pointed. There are castellations along the rooftops. There are finials, which are further pointed decorative subjects on the corners of the buildings, mostly reaching up to the sky, as it were. And then there are buttresses, and those buttresses in the more sophisticated great cathedrals of Europe tend to be described as flying buttresses with a space towards the top but supporting the walls. And for Barbados, with great hurricanes destroying churches in 1780 and 1831, those buttresses became very important as mechanisms of making the churches resist subsequent hurricanes. Here at Christ Church, they didn't think they needed buttresses because the walls are 3 feet thick. It's built like a fortress. A word about those arches. Gothic arches are usually quite pointed, rather like the shape of my hands put together here with a sharp pointed arch. Roman arches, which were actually originating in the Middle East, they are the rounded arches, and the rounded arches are very popular in Barbados. They were introduced in the Georgian era of architecture, and they're all over the garrison buildings and in many Barbadian homes. And in fact, in 1970, arches became popular again, and I describe that as the epidemic of Roman arches in Barbados. These arches here at Christ Church are not your typical pointed arches. They're a rather flattened pointed arch, and that's quite unusual for Barbados. Now, with the destruction of the church by fire, many of the details of the building were lost, including memorial tablets. Just a few of them remain. And this is an interesting one, because this is the memorial tablet of Reynold Alleyne of Mount Alleyne in the parish of St. James. Now, the famous Alleyne family owned a lot of land in St. James, St. Peter, St. Lucy, and St. Andrew. And Sir John Gay Alleyne, his son, was the founder of the Alleyne School and the chairman of the Codrington College Trust, and he was a fantastic man. Why Reynold Alleyne, who was named after the ancestor who was shot in the landing of the Civil War in Speightstown in 1652, why Reynold Alleyne was buried here is not clear at all, because this was very much away from home. But this is one of the old memorial tablets, 1749, that was preserved. And over here, we have one of Elizabeth Sewell, the widow of Richard Sewell, who died in 1728. And of course, the Sewells were the owners of Sewell Plantation, which became our Grantley Adams Airport. As you come through the church gate, on the right, the second tombs you come to are those of Professor J. Sidney Dash, or John Sidney Dash, and his wife Sybil. Now, Sidney Dash was a very famous Barbadian who became a professor in Canada, and as his tombstone says here, he was distinguished both for community service and for a lifelong contribution in the field of science and agriculture in Canada, Guyana, and the Caribbean. And he was truly a Renaissance man. The book I have in my hand is the very famous Pocket Guide to the West Indies and British Guyana, which went through more than 10 editions. And this was written by the famous Sir Algernon Aspinall, but revised by Professor J. Sidney Dash, OBE, in the 10th edition. And the description at the introduction in the 1954 edition says that Professor Dash has largely retained the narrative, notably in the historical and topographical sections, but the introduction is entirely new, as well as a great deal more. Dash was a man of extremely wide experience. He knew the Caribbean like the back of his hand. In addition to being a scientist, he was a wonderful writer. So he is one of our very important Barbadians who has been largely forgotten, but who occupies a very prominent place in Christchurch Graveyard.
This is the vault of the Chase family. With its mysterious occurrences, it has been written about and has fascinated Barbadians and visitors for many years.
The members of the Chase family were buried in leaden coffins within this vault, and the vault was opened up every time a new member of the family was interred.
It was built for James Elliot, who was never buried in it. And then the very first person we buried in here was a woman called Thomasina Goddard, probably a relative of the Goddard family of today. And she was put in here in a wooden coffin. Then shortly after, it was acquired by Thomas Chase. And soon after its acquisition, one of his young daughters died, and she was buried in here. And then in 1812, another daughter, Dorcas, died, and she was buried. And if you came from well-off families, you were buried in lead coffins as opposed to wooden coffins. And I can tell you, these are extremely heavy. It's impossible for one person to lift the lead coffin by themselves. Well, young Dorcas died, as I said, and she was buried in here, and shortly after, some months after, her father, Thomas Chase, died. And Thomas is buried in an elaborate lead coffin. And when the mourners took the coffin into the grave, they noticed that the pre-existing coffins were disturbed and turned around and placed against the wall. Yes, Rona, exactly. So they put them all back in position, and then years later, a young Brewster child died, was buried in here. When they opened the vault, the same thing was observed. The coffins were all disturbed, including this heavy, elaborate lead coffin of Thomas Chase. That one was actually placed on its head. I don't know whether it had anything to do with the rumor It is alleged that this Thomas Chase was not a very nice person. But after that, of course, then, Brewster man died, and again the vault was open, and again the coffins were in great disarray. And then finally, a woman called Thomasina Clark died, and she was going to be buried in here. And when they opened up the vault,
they discovered that instead of the coffins being neatly laid out when the vault was closed, the coffins were all over the place, as if some tremendous spiritual force had leant them against the wall, moved one on top of another, and so on.
Word got around, and the governor came, Lord Combermere at the time, and half the island, it is alleged, came out, and they put sand in the bottom of the vault, and they arranged the coffins in the correct position, and they sealed it with their personal seals, etc. And then when the vault was reopened, they observed the same thing, this huge disorder inside, coffins thrown against the wall and so on. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. There was no evidence at all of vandalism. And it would have required a large group of individuals to go in here and take up those lead coffins and throw them against the wall and so on.
And as a result, all of the coffins were finally removed from the vault and buried separately elsewhere in the churchyard.
And since then it's remained open like this, and nobody's been buried in here since.
It's a fascinating story of the paranormal which really occupied the minds of everyone who visited Barbados. What is rather sad is that the tomb is not well maintained, even though it's described in our visitors' guides.
I remember coming up here one lunchtime, and I was in first form. The junior boys were not supposed to mix with the big boys, but I was always, if you want to call it, uppity. So I came up here, and I was asked what I was doing up here, and I said, well, I'm up here. And I went in here, only to find myself locked.
Oh
I couldn't get out. It was terrifying because, I mean, you'd heard all these stories, and when I was inside, I was started to wonder if there would be vibrations. I remained in here for a few minutes, and then luckily they opened up for me. But this is the Chase vault.
Here's an interesting story from this. Apparently, some years ago, an English family came out here, and I think they removed a small stone piece of the vault and took it back to England with them. But then they experienced a series of misfortunes in the family, and one terrible incident happened after another. And finally they said, you know, the root of all of this is the stone that we took from the Chase vault, and they packaged it up, sent it back to Barbados and said, put this stone back in the vault where it belongs. We want this weight off our shoulders.
We're now standing in front of what has to be by far the most imposing of all of the tombs in the Christchurch graveyard. This is the tomb of Howard Ambrose Carner. Now, no Barbadian knows anything about Howard Ambrose Carner, or H.A. Carner. It's an unusual name. It is not Garner, which I know some people have said they thought this was a Mr. Garner. It is not Garner, it is Carner. And who was he? Great mystery. He was an American, and he spent most of his working life in Venezuela. The story is that a very clever biscuit seller called Hamilton went to Venezuela in the 19th century, 1880 or so, and he became acquainted with the president of Venezuela. And he persuaded the president, for a very small sum, to allow him to have possession of an area known as Bermudez, where there was an asphalt lake. And he set about developing the asphalt, which obviously had huge potential. Now, he was such a clever man, he managed to marry the niece of the president. And there's a lovely romantic story about that, which you can find on the web. But when Castro, the next president, nationalized the Bermudez Asphalt Company owned from New York, he retained the services of Howard Ambrose Carner to run the whole show. So he lived and he worked in Venezuela for a couple of decades. Unlike most of the people involved in oil and asphalt, he never became particularly wealthy. And when he died at 51, his obituary in the New York Times described him as being atypical in not having made a fortune out of oil, but having worked ferociously in the difficult environment of Bermudez in Venezuela, and dying young at 51 of Bright's disease, which is really heart failure with a great deal of swelling in the days before they could treat it successfully. Now, why Mr. Carner is buried in Barbados with this wonderful monument is anybody's guess. The obituary described him as having been resident in Trinidad, although working in Venezuela, and an American citizen, and here he is buried in paradise. Well, we have to assume that his wife, Ida, must have been a Barbadian, and she decided therefore to bring him home to paradise on his way to eternal bliss above. There are two wonderful tombs of great Barbadians here. I'm standing right behind the tomb of the Honourable Winter Crawford. Now, Winter Crawford was the great Bajan politician of the 20th century who never became Prime Minister, as was often expected. He began with Sir Grantley Adams back in the 30s and early 40s.
Some argue at a particular stage in our political history of equal importance, or maybe even more important than Grantley Adams was.
He subsequently formed his own Congress party and split with Adams, and then when Errol Barrow came along and they plotted the formation of the Democratic Labour Party, Errol Barrow, along with Sir Theodore Brancker, Sir James Tudor and Winter Crawford were the elder statesmen, the thinkers behind the Democratic Labour Party. And Winter Crawford was, of course, a Minister of Government, a member of the Cabinet, a very prominent politician.
And of course he was a journalist. A lot of people hope to forget that. And he represented my home parish, St. Philip.
He was also, interestingly, a hotelier, and he owned the famous little San Remo Hotel on the Maxwell Beach. And so he and my father often swam together and talked politics on the beach at Maxwell's. And his son is a colleague of mine, an anaesthetist who lives and works in Canada, a graduate of the University of the West Indies.
Winter Crawford was committed to the development of Barbados, and indeed to the Caribbean. And this evoked from him actions of fervor, determination, resolution, chivalry, and strong character. The truth is that his first priority was the people of Barbados. He loved this country, and he loved the people.
I admire Winter Crawford. I admired his tenacity. I admired his determination to write and speak the truth. And I admired his sense of urgency. I was struck by his sense of urgency because he felt that there was not enough time to do the things that need to happen in Barbadian society. He was a radical, he said to me, not by genetic inclination, but by choice. He once said to me, and I quote, he once said that you could not be any other than a radical in Barbados. He said, in Barbados, a conservative in his time, a conservative is like a chicken whose head has been cut off. It is very animated, makes lots of noise, but in fact, it's really dead. It does not quite know that as yet, but in fact, it is really dead. And that is how he saw his politics. Urgency. He believed in human agency, that the individual can impact on the process. the individual can transform the process, and then ultimately history is about that, human agency.
He's perhaps one of these forgotten people, but until the memoirs published by Professor Marshall rekindled interest to Barbadians.
In addition to Professor Sir Woodville Marshall's successful effort at having Winter Crawford immortalized in a book, founder of the Nation newspaper and then editor-in-chief Harold Hoyt has also ensured that his memory will live on forever.
I met Winter Crawford when I was, of course, a very little boy, because his family and our family were very, very close. And we used to spend the summer vacation in Maxville, not Cattle Wash, not Bathsheba, not Civil Sands, but Maxville. We couldn't afford those other destinations. And I recall as a little boy seeing this very big guy who spoke on the corner of his mouth like this, and who was very, very passionate about Barbados. This is the first thing that struck me about him. And I was a little boy, very, very, very passionate about Barbados, arguing things with my family. My mother was a very fervent Grantley Adams person, and she remained very, very quiet once Winter started to speak, because I believe she did not feel she was any measure for him. I felt convinced that this was some person who had a real contribution to make to this society. So it wasn't surprising then when I assumed responsibility for the Nation newspaper that I was anxious to make that kind of connection, because the things that he said and the things that he did were the things that I envisaged we should be doing for Barbados. I remember when we first started, he wanted me very much to call the Nation the Observer. But we felt at that time that we had to create a name that represented what we were seeing to do at that particular time in the immediate post-independence era. So we became close in terms of talking about what was happening, and he was never reluctant to call me and to engage in long discussions on issues about the newspaper. And, you know, once people attacked the paper, he was the first to call to advise how I should respond. If we had legal issues, he would be one to say, you must stand up and fight, and this is why you must fight, and so on. So he was a tremendous inspiration to us, certainly in our formative years, right up until the end. When I knew, therefore, that he had spoken with Woodville and that he wanted his memoirs published, I had the opportunity on a couple of occasions to give him the assurance that the Nation newspaper would do its best to make sure that this happened. I think he was very, very worried about that, especially in his declining years, because I suppose as we get older and we feel less able to achieve some of those things, we want to make sure that there's somebody else who's bought into the concept and who's prepared to take it forward. And I gave him the assurance right up until his last days in hospital, when he couldn't even speak. Just by his grasp of my hand, he gave me the assurance that he understood that I was going to make a commitment to getting this done.
It is generally accepted that no history of St. Philip would be relevant, even if it is time contextual, without paying due regard to the work of Winter Crawford. No modern political party since 1937 and into the period of our intense nation building was untouched by the intellectual power, compassion, and foresight of this noble Barbadian. On Saturday, August the 29th, 2009, the Six Roads Roundabout was renamed the Winter Crawford Circle.
On the left is the grave of Sir Edwy Talma, and he, of course, was a member of cabinet and a representative for the parish of Christchurch in the old double-member constituencies.
So Edwy, take us back to those early years when you first entered politics. What was it that persuaded you to go into the field of politics?
I was the first General Secretary of the Barbados Progressive League and served there for many years. I assisted Sir Grantley Adams in appearing before the Royal Commission. As you know, the Royal Commission did very important work for this country. And it is through the Royal Commission that we had independence. The Progressive League was engaged in organizing workers and gave birth to the Barbados Labour Party. I became the General Secretary of the Barbados Labour Party. Well, Sir Grantley was responsible for the change over from the Progressive League to the Barbados Labour Party, and retained me as General Secretary of the Barbados Labour Party.
And a member of the very prominent Talma family, who were hoteliers, the late Dr. Trevor Talma, dentist of course, his wife Norma, artist, and the Talmas have been very famous, especially as here in Christchurch there was a very famous lady Talma who was a member of the church committee and was honoured by the government for her services to the country.
And so we conclude this week's edition of Tales from the Tombs, and that brings to an end the first series. Special thanks to our tour guide, Senator Professor Henry Fraser, Dr. Carl Watson, historian Trevor Marshall, and Rudon Eversley. Of course, I must also say thank you to you, the viewers. I appreciated your kind words and your criticisms. Now, you would have noticed that we are ending the program standing next to a memorial which we have not yet called attention to. That is an indication that Series 2 is coming soon. I encourage you to join us for that first program when Stella, Lady St. John, the wife of former Prime Minister, the late Sir Harold Bernard St. John, will reveal tales from his tomb. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Once again, thank you for being with me, and all God's blessings. Good evening.